When I was younger, I used to read the newspaper every day, and it was the print edition, the one you opened up that you felt in your fingers, not the electronic one. One of the things I would always do every morning, I'd read the comics. And one of the comics I liked was one by a writer named Bill Keane. Bill Keane drew a comic strip, a one-panel comic strip called Family Circus. I like Family Circus because, first of all, it was easy to read, quick, and it captured the flavor of family life in a very humorous way. One of the themes that he had through the year in various times was the concept of not me. He would have a strip where something bad would happen, something would be broken, and mom or dad would say, "Who did this?" And the kids would all say, "Not me." One of them is what I'd like to show you this morning, a panel that was written by Bill Keane. They're at the dinner table, and somebody's kicking the table, very common thing. And so the dad says, "All right, who's kicking the table?" And around the table they go, "Not me." "I don't know." "Not me." "Nobody." Then you look under the table and you find all these ghosts under there with those names on their front kicking the table. This is a humorous way of saying, I didn't do anything. Human beings do not like to accept the blame and the responsibility when bad things happen to them. Every lawyer, a criminal defense attorney will tell you that the best defense there is everybody is to blame but my client. And so if they can shift the blame to society in some way, maybe they can get their client off, because there's never been a man who's been convicted who really was to blame, at least if you listen to attorneys. But this sharpens itself in today's lesson. James wants to talk about the concept of responsibility, especially in the middle of temptation. When I'm tempted, when I sin, who's at fault? Who should I blame? It can't be me. I didn't do anything wrong. I got drawn into this and it just happened to me. And so James wants to explore that. How in the world did we get in the mess that we're in? And perhaps by doing so, by looking at this and seeing the reality of what happens with sin and temptation, we can avoid some of the problems going forward in our lives. Really what James is doing in today's lesson is not just prescriptive, but preventive, as we will see. It's interesting that this passage that we're going to study this morning, James 1, 12 to 15, begins with what we would call a beatitude. You know what a beatitude is. It's one of those passages that begins with the words, "Blessed are," or "Blessed is." Now, we're very aware of what Beatitudes are because we see them in a series at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. And you read those, and we have read them all of our lives, and we just accept them for what they are, that these are the conditions of being blessed and happy in God's kingdom. But it wasn't just a New Testament thing. It wasn't just for Jesus. If you go back to Psalm chapter 1, Psalm 1 is a beatitude. This is a beatitude. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. That's the beatitude. But why do you think James starts with the beatitude? Why start there? Why not just launch into discussion? You remember last week's lesson, he started off with "Count it all joy, my brother, when you face various trials." Now he talks about being blessed when you endure it. They seem very similar in the way these two passages begin, but there may be a good reason. Listen to what he says. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. In other words, you have these two words that we've already seen before. The word steadfast, which means to stand or bear under something, to stand the strain, to be more than just resentful and resigning to the circumstances, that you live your best even under the worst possible circumstances, and you continue your Christian life regardless of what's going on around you. That's being steadfast. It's what we learned last week. Then the second word we saw last week was the word trial, which is this word which means to put under enough pressure to find out what is true and what is not true, and what is genuine and what is not. And what we said last week was we are tested by the trials of life, and for them it was probably persecution was the main one, but trials can come in all kinds of flavors, such as any kind of suffering, any kind of loss, anything that pains us, anything that puts us under stress. So he said, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, there's that other word, test, and we've seen it too in verse 3. When he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. It's interesting that the blessing is about standing the test and remaining steadfast, and what you will gain from that. Why is that important? What does that do? Why does James begin a discussion that we're going to have today about temptation? Why does he talk about the crown? Well, the crown, first of all, what is it? There are two different kinds of crowns. There's the diadem, which is the jewel-encrusted gold piece that goes on the head of a monarch. That's usually what we think of when we think about crown, the diadem. But there was a different kind of crown, and that was a laurel-wreathed circle that was placed on the head of a victor. Sometimes the victor was someone who has won in one of the Olympic game type contests that they had all over the Grecian and Roman world. In other words, the athlete who has won the biggest race, who has endured to the end, he gets the crown, the laurel wreath, signifying he's the victor. But there was another one, that is, if when a general would come back to war as the conquering hero, they would put on his head the same kind of crown. The Stephanos, where we get the name Stephen, goes on his head, this crown. It was always a sign of the one who has overcome something. And so it was that if you think about the reason why James starts where he starts, when you endure because you can see the finish line. If you know that you have to suffer for a short period of time, you're probably going to do better than if you think this is never going to end. It is said that men who are taken prisoners in war, who become prisoners of war, as long as they hold to their belief that one day the war will be over and they will go home and they can construct the house that they're building in their minds, they'll be okay. But the moment they believe that is hopeless, that there's no end, that there's no reward, that there's no end to their suffering, they give up. And they quit wanting to live. I think James begins with the crown concept and the Beatitude because we have to keep our eye on the fact that there is a reason we endure things the way we endure them. There is a reason we stand the strain. There is a reason for our steadfastness, and this is what it is. But as we go forward, if you read this text this morning, these three verses, James 1:12 to 15, the question is, if you read the context, what's the trial that James is talking about? Last week we talked about trials in general. The overarching concept of suffering. Specifically for them, it was probably persecution, but it's any trial. James never specified it. But if you were to look in the text today, most English translations take the same exact word for trial that we've looked at, and they bring it into another word that we know well called temptation. Now, is there a difference between trial and temptation? Obviously there is, but it is the difference like this, that all dogs are animals, but not all animals are dogs. And that's why temptation is a kind of a trial, a specific form of trial that tends to be more prevalent with human beings than others. We all are going to be tempted, it seems. At least that has been our experience. We all have been. But that leads us to another question. Is it okay to be tempted? Now, what was your first reaction to that question? Did you say, oh, no, we don't need to be tempted because temptation equals sin? Well, let's test that out. In Matthew chapter 4, we're told that the Spirit led Jesus into the desert to be tempted or tested, same words, by the devil. Was temptation wrong for Jesus? Did Jesus do wrong because he had temptation? Because that's what he felt. Because that's what he experienced. Now we go, oh no, that's not it. He was tempted like we are, but without sin. So there must be a difference between temptation and sin. Jesus was tempted. So if Jesus is tempted and it's not sin, then our temptation is not sin. Now that's where it gets complicated because we tend to intertwine them and where we can't pull them apart. We talk about temptation as being the sinful idea, the sinful act. You should never be tempted. And yet, as James is going to show in this lesson, that's really impossible for us. In fact, he goes on in verse 13, says, let no one say when he is tempted. When he is tempted. He doesn't say if he is tempted, when he is tempted. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. Now let's stop there for a minute. How in the world can anybody say that God is tempting them? We go, well, we all know that. Really? Because it's much more complicated than we'd like to cleanse our minds of. We probably know it because we've read this passage too many times, and we know it up here, we don't feel it down here. Is God to blame for our problems? It seems we've always done that. Go back to the very first sin, the very first moment in Genesis chapter 3. Satan comes, he entices Eve to eat the fruit. She sees it, she picks it, she eats it, she gives it to Adam, he eats it, and suddenly their eyes are opened and they feel naked, exposed. And they go hide in the bushes. Then God comes walking in the cool of the day and he says, Adam, where are you? He knows. Adam says, I'm in the bushes hiding. Why are you hiding? Because I'm naked. Who told you were naked? He knows that too. And so they come along and they begin to have this discussion, and God says, what have you done? Now, he's not asking for information. He's eliciting a confession at this point. Now, listen to the confession that Adam makes about why he sinned. The man said, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate. Listen carefully. Adam says, I'm not to blame for this problem. This woman, now, husbands have been blaming their wives for things for years, ever since the very beginning. So this is nothing new. The woman whom you gave to be with me, whom you gave to me, be with me. You gave her there. Notice where the finger is pointing. It's not what I did, it's what you did. This woman and you are my problems. You see how easy it is to blame God? Why didn't you fix this? Because I'm expecting you to fix the problems of life. And that's part of our problems. But what's the logic behind all that? Why is it that mankind seems to think that somewhere along the line, God is at fault for our problems? Well, there are a lot of ways to look at this. The question we need to ask ourselves as we look at this whole topic that James brings up is, why might we want to blame God? And I think there are logical reasons that people make up, at least they run through their mind, of why they think God is responsible for our problems. So let's run the logic line down the track. The first is a belief that we believe that God is in control of all the things in the universe. Do you not believe that? We say it often enough. In bad times, we say, God's still in control. And so it's a firm held belief that if you believe the sovereignty of God, that you believe that God is in control of all things in the universe. But then that brings us to the second point of logic. But being in control means that you have the ability to allow or disallow things to happen. When you are in control of your car, you're doing the steering. You decide where it's going to go and how fast it's going to go. The car doesn't decide that on its own. And if God is in control, He's steering and He's putting us in the direction we need to go. That's the natural inference to control, by the way. Now, that leads us to the next part. And if God allowed it to happen when He could have changed it, He must be responsible. Every Christian who turns atheist comes to this point. If a child dies in a famine in Africa, and all it took was rain, and the only one who could give rain was God, and God withheld His rain, and this child died, God must be responsible for that. How can you believe a God like that? Does that go, oh, I hate that. I don't believe it, but it sounds too good. See, it just irritates. It tastes like vinegar in our mouths. It doesn't sound right. And so here's a different way. Jewish rabbis said it like this. Same kind of thought patterns, just different words and different concepts. God created man. We believe that. God created who we are and everything that we are, right? Isn't that true? Now, the second part is, if you just look around, you can realize that man has evil tendencies. You know, if you watch the evening news, the first 10 minutes is nothing more than rapes, murders, and thefts. It's all the evil tendencies of our world. If God creates man and man has evil tendencies, then that must mean that God put them there. And we go, can't be true, can't be true, can't be true. But if God created us and we do evil, then why didn't God create the evil that we do? You go, I don't like that. That doesn't sound right. And I agree with you, frankly. But that's kind of how the logic seems to run through things. This is what happens when men are trying to wrap their minds around things that they can't wrap their minds around. They come out with some bad decisions. Now, the rabbis even had book, chapter, and verse for believing that. When they go to Genesis chapter 6, you get the story of the flood, for instance. The story of the flood is that at the beginning it says, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Then the Lord regretted or repented that He had made human beings on earth. It was deeply troubled, so He's going to wipe them out. Why? They are deeply flawed. He created them. He made them, and they're deeply flawed. That's how the rabbis saw this. Again, we go, huh? That doesn't sound right. And it doesn't seem to balance in our minds that a good, benevolent God who loves us and gives His Son for us would lead us down the primrose path to death at the same time. It doesn't seem to balance. So we come to the debate of their day. Understand, there was a lot of things that in James's time, everyone who was Jewish was thinking about, even Jewish Christians. They were trying to deal with various concepts in their world. And there was this debate, kind of like the raging debates on the street, the water cooler talk, if you will. But they tended to take place in print. And some of the places they held in print were a series of books that were written before Jesus was born, but they were informing Jewish thought for many years. We call them the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are the hidden books, and they tend to be today in Catholic Bibles, but not in ours, because we don't believe they're inspired. And the truth is, the Jews didn't believe that they stood with the law and the prophets, but they were good books to study and good books to learn from, and they would give you a lot of good information. And in fact, when you read some of the things that Jesus taught, they have these faint allusions to things you read about in the Apocrypha. And that's true about James here. And those were books, they were much like commentaries. Now, when I was growing up, adult Bible classes run like this. Some might say, well, Johnson says, they were referring to Johnson's notes, a commentary of the 19th century. And Johnson seemed to hold sway as much as Scripture did. Today, people will carry a John MacArthur commentary under their arm to church, and they'll open that during Bible class, and they'll read John MacArthur. Now, what that means is that those books were like those we do. They were trying to deal with the debate that were happening and the discussions that were taking place. One of those books was the book of Sirach. Sirach was written 200 years before Jesus was born. Sirach has some interesting things in it. The other name it's called by is Ecclesiasticus, but Sirach is dealing at one point with the concept of, is God responsible for my sin? Does that sound vaguely familiar to James chapter 1 and verse 13? Is God responsible for my sin? And what Sirach does is he echoes what people are trying to say when they get caught in sin. So in the 15th chapter of Sirach, you hear what people are saying. Because of the Lord, I left the right way. Or in verse 12, he'd say, it was he who led me astray. That was what people were saying. So Sirach wants to confront that thinking and rebut it. So he begins a series of arguments. The Lord hates abominations, all abominations. It's not in his nature to want them. He left man in the power of his own inclinations. If you will, you can keep the commandments, and to act faithfully is a matter of your own choice. Choice is there. Before a man are life and death, and whichever he chooses will be given to him. And he has not commanded anyone to be ungodly, and he has not given any permission to sin. See, what Sirach is trying to do is the same thing that James is going to tackle, because this is a big problem for his people. That's why they're reading all this stuff. And what Sirach says, you can't blame God because God didn't give you permission to sin, and God hates sin in the first place. It's your choice if you sin, not his. Now, then where does sin come from? See, there's the problem you get into. If God didn't do it, where did it come from? If God creates man, but man is sinful, how did man get to be sinful if God didn't create him that way? Sounds twisted, doesn't it? That's answered by another one of those apocryphal books, the book of Enoch. Now, Enoch is a book that you read the words of Enoch in the New Testament, in the letter that Jude wrote. He has a passage in there where he talks about it, what Enoch refers to. But when Enoch writes, he says, perhaps it's the fallen angels. If you got to blame somebody for sin, let's blame the fallen angels for teaching us how to do it. We wouldn't have done this by ourselves. They would have done it. They taught us. But the other thing he has to say is sin has not been sent upon the earth, but man himself created it. For Enoch, the thought pattern was, we have seen the enemy and he is us. We created our own problems. And so it's with that kind of background that James is writing these words in verse 13. Because he says, God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's difficult to think about because it looks so true on its basis, but what does it mean he's not tempted by evil? This is the best way, I think, to put it. We must understand, as someone has said, that temptation is an impulse to sin. We want to sin. There's something in us that is drawn to sin. But since God is not susceptible to any such desire for evil, he cannot be seen as desiring that it be brought about in man. In other words, God is free from evil means because God is free from evil. If you can't envision evil, you don't want to you can't help somebody else get into it. So James said, well, where then does all this come from? Well, he says each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Two words there in there, enticed and lured. Enticement is a word that would come out of someone who is hunting, and they're hunting bear. They're going to throw a piece of raw meat out to coax the bear out of his den. That's the enticement. It's to get you, to draw you out to where you get to envision a pattern of life that this could happen to you. Because the next stage is the lure, and that's when the worm goes on the hook. That's the thing that really catches you and as you really want. The first is, I want to know if I want it. The second is, I really want it. And he says, so each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed, but it's all by his own desire. It's his own desire. We don't all have the same desires. What you want is not what I want. What tempts you does not tempt me. If you put a coconut pie in front of me right now, I am pretty free from eating that because I don't like coconut. But if you put chocolate pie on the counter, you better get out of the way because I'll run you over trying to get to it. That's the difference. The desires are different between the two. So he says, you are lured and enticed by your own desire. What does that mean? Desire is wrong. Should we have no desires? There were some people in the first century and before who believed the answer to the problem of evil was just not to have desire. And so they'd go out in the desert to where they were away from all the temptations, all the desires of the world, and they found out they desired even more because it was all in their minds at that point. That's the problem. Understand something. God creates us with desire for our own good. Just think about some things. God creates us with hunger. Why? Because when we get hungry, we will eat, and we need food for survival. Without the hunger impulse, we wouldn't survive. We've all known people who they've gotten older and they just don't want to eat anymore, and they waste away and die. He creates in us the thirst desire so that we will hydrate. When we get thirsty, we drink. That replenishes things that we need. God creates this interesting problem of handling our life through desire. He creates the desire for intimacy. In Genesis chapter 2, he saw that man was alone and said, it's not good that man should be alone, so I'll make a helper fit for him. We have this desire for intimacy. It's inbred to us. It's who we are. It's what God has made us. However, the problem is not that we have those desires, it's that we transfer those desires to something of a corrupted form to them. For instance, there is the God-given desire for hunger. But we turn that into gluttony, eating to excess. We have the God-given desire for thirst, and we cross the line and we make it drunkenness. We have this desire for intimacy, but there are some who trade it for the cheap substitute of fornication. God creates the desires and we corrupt them by our behavior to get immediate satisfaction for what we want, rather than getting the desire met that God has put into us. That's part of the problem here. And James then changes the metaphor a little bit, and he begins to go with the birth process. He says, then when desire has conceived, when it has been implanted and it begins to take shape, that's conception. When it conceives, there's a point in time where you take the desire, you begin to turn around in your mind, and you begin to say, I think I could do this way. You concoct a plan. And then he goes on to say, then it gives birth to sin. Then you say, now here's the plan, and you execute it. You go do what you've thought about doing. When you do what you've thought about doing, that's when the action, the sin takes place. And then when sin is fully grown, when it completes its cycle, when it takes over your life, when it becomes the only thing in your life that you want to do, to fulfill your needs in the way you want to fulfill them, that lifestyle will bring forth death. Now, that's easy to describe, but it's hard to understand in the description. But I want to take you back to a place where you can understand it in real life, real human terms. 2 Samuel chapter 11. It is the story of David and Bathsheba. Just listen to how this goes. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. I'm going to suggest to you that's the enticement. He saw something. It drew his attention. And the woman was very beautiful. Now the lure begins to take place. If she's beautiful, I wonder what she's like. And then David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is she not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? He asked more questions. He's fashioning the plot. I wonder if I could be with her. I wonder how safe it could be. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him. He bites down on that hook, and he lays with her. The sin. You see, enticement, lure, conception, sin. It's all there. In every sin pattern in the world, you can do it with the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve were Achan stealing the silver in Joshua chapter 7. It's all there. Every time a person sins, we do these things. Because this is the timeline, the life cycle, if you will, of temptation. There's desire, followed by conception, followed by birth, followed by maturity. Now, the question we started with, is temptation wrong? See, Jesus was tempted, so temptation can't be wrong. The problem is, temptation only sets the table. We have to eat the food. So when does sin occur? Does it occur at the desire? At the conception? At the birth? Or at the maturity? Now, we can't really stop our desires, but the conception part begins the planning phase. And the birth section is the acting phase. Somewhere in that general vicinity, when you begin to hatch the plan and you begin to act on what your thought patterns are, sin begins to be implanted in your life. And this little pattern teaches us something about temptation. As I said before, this is not just prescriptive, this is preventive. If you look at this, you can see all the things that we need to know to deal with temptation in our lives. First of all, you need to know your own desires. What are your weak points? One of the smartest things we've ever said, I was attending a seminar one day, and there was a family therapist who was talking to preachers, and he said, you need to find out the things that cause problems in your life, because you're going to find out that will be the place that can undo your ministry quickly. And I've seen that in others, and I've seen that in myself. Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it lust? Is it greed? Now, I've seen all of those wreak havoc in the lives of people. Where is the desire that's going to undo you? It's all there. You just have to know thyself. But the second is be aware of your environment, because it will provide all the triggers. Think about what would have happened to David had he not stood at that roof line, put his hands on the stone of the parapet, and gazed over longingly at Bathsheba. How would that have changed the equation? He crafted an environment in which he encouraged this to come. Had he looked and said, I need to turn around and go back to my bedchamber, this might have changed the whole story. Your environment, the place you put yourself in, will be very important. As the proverb says, you cannot prevent the birds from flying over your head, but you can prevent them from nesting in your hair. That means beware your environment, because it's going to create the conditions right for things to happen. Then the final thing is when you find yourself getting caught, when you find the conception taking place, stop right then and walk away. It's not too late to stop things, even when you're thinking and even when you're wanting. You can always stop and not take that next step. That will be the safety valve But that's hard to do. God's not at fault for our sin. We walk that path all by ourselves. And God says, but you don't have to if you'll just listen to how I want you to be. Thank you for joining me. Next week, we'll continue our study of the book of James as we continue through the first chapter. So thank you for being part of this class today, and I'll see you again next Sunday.